First and foremost, we'd like to thank our speech coach, Mr. Kennedy, as well as our coach from last year, Mr. Rund, who actually introduced us to debate and taught us all the basics of what we're doing today.
Additionally, we'd like to thank all of the other coaches that have helped us out this year, specifically Mr. Gaston and Natalie Jacobs, who have helped us a lot, as well as our team as a whole, who consistently makes us better and challenges us to new heights.
We also would like to express our thanks to the entire speech and debate community in Indiana and the National Association that gives us the opportunity to go to all of these tournaments and that gives us the competition so that we can all learn from each other. We'd also like to thank our families who are consistently supportive of everything that we do here, and we know that it's not easy, but that the payoff is worth it, and we're incredibly thankful for you.
We would also like to thank the senior graduating team from last year. Without their support, we never would have done this event at all.
And lastly, we'd like to thank everyone that's competed today and all the great talents. Thank you.
Okay, so first I would really like to just thank our coach, team, and parents, without whom we would not even be here today. Thanking Mr. Smith for being such a wonderful and inspiring teacher and really showing us all to love debate just as much as you do. Secondly, thank you to our fantastic mentors who came in after school and helped us with practices. Their time and dedication taught us so much, so thank you very much. Also, to our upperclassmen, your guidance and inspiration helped me so much. I know, just like being able to ask you guys questions and learn so much and look up to you guys really helped. And also, thank you to our underclassmen who were always so amazing and blew me away and always made me want to do better because, like, you guys are so great. And finally, thank you to our opponents and everyone who came to or helped run the event today, because this has been such a great day and it's been so lovely debating each and every one of you, and we're so lucky to be here. Thank you.
A lot of the things I was going to say, we'll just be repeating her. So again, I'd like to thank our amazing coaches, Mr. Aaron Smith, Mr. Daniel Smith, and all of the other coaches who help out our debate team. I'd also like to thank my parents for driving me to debate tournaments every single morning, early in the morning, or not every single morning, but every tournament morning. Obviously, I'd like to thank my team and the other team for coming here and debating us. This is going to be an amazing and incredibly fun round. And I'd love to thank all my friends on the West Lafayette debate team for supporting, and yeah, love you guys.
Okay, so I want to thank coaches as well, because they're the ones that put in an extreme amount of work every day. I want to thank the parents for waking up early and for dealing with our losses and our wins. I want to thank everyone in this room and the people still competing outside of it, because you guys are what makes, you guys make debate. You guys make debate special. And finally, I want to thank everyone on our team. So, thanks.
So my thank yous are pretty much the exact same as what they said. I'd really like to thank our debate coach, Mr. Smith, who has really created this safe environment where we can express our feelings but also express our love for debate. I'd also like to thank my family with all their support and being, like they said, the early mornings, the early drives to school. I'd also like to thank not only the entire Westside team but my Worlds team, because we've been able to come together and I guess we've kind of inspired each other to do better. And especially I'd like to thank Jason Wang. He's shown me what true drive is for debate, and he inspires me to do better every day. Thank you.
All right. So I'm just going to have the judges raise their hand as I call their names so that the contestants can see where they're sitting. Ms. Brown, Ms. Camacho, Flores Camacho, sorry, Ms. Carmen, Ms. Chowdhury, and Mr. Anderson. All right, you guys listen to that? All right.
Good luck to everybody, and I will be back to collect ballots at the end.
As a Supreme Court justice once said, "My right to swing my fist ends where yours begins." This is a classic example of how one's freedom of liberty is limited by another's freedom of safety. And because we can see the problem with countries that do not have enough regulations on hate speech and the benefits of the ones that do, we are proud to propose the House motion, "This House supports restrictions on free speech to combat the rise of hate speech." Now, to begin this debate today, I'd like to pose a series of definitions. The first of which is of speech being an expression of thoughts and feelings. 2, of restrictions, the limitation or control of someone or something. And we would define hate speech in accordance with the Public Order Act of 1986, which is currently in effect in the UK. This means that abusive and threatening speech against any racial, religious, gender, or LGBT groups would be outlawed. The worldwide implementation of the Public Order Act will also function as our mechanism for today's debate. Throughout today's debate, we will be proposing for 3 key reasons. First, that public safety is improved in nations which nominally restrict free speech. Limiting hate speech perpetrated by governments would limit the persecution of minorities. And a third contention that my teammate will elaborate on in a later speech. This brings us to our first contention, that we've seen a positive precedent of the Public Order Act working in Britain itself. The Public Order Act has promoted the moderation of political discourse. The elimination of overly abusive speech targeted towards minorities removes voices from the most extreme ends of the political spectrum. Britain has seen clear benefits from this, as the radical politicians in their nation hold considerably less power than they do in the less regulated nations, such as the United States. British politicians are able to express their political beliefs when they do not abuse or threaten the people they represent.
By saying that this free speech is actually influencing what politicians are being elected, this is showing that these restrictions on free speech are affecting who is in power. So that right there is a problematic statement.
I would certainly agree, and I think that we need to actually limit hate speech for this reason, because people in a representative government need to actually represent all of the people in their nation, not simply the majority groups. Additionally, the US allows hate speech not only to exist, but to gain popularity. So much that local, state, and federal lawmakers use hate speech on a consistent basis and win both election and re-election. An Alabama representative can use the N-word in a town hall meeting and advocate for the reinstitution of segregation. And our executive can refer to Mexicans as rapists and murderers, can advocate for a ban against an entire religious group, and can refer to African nations with words too crude to repeat in this debate. These negative voices are minimized under the Public Order Act, denying them the platform and support needed to become action. Additionally, Britain has not seen the same promotion of hate-fueled violence that the United States has. The white supremacy movement in the United States has gained traction through blatant and brazen declaration of racism, a problem that would not exist under the Public Order Act. This movement has led to nationwide violence, most notably the riots in Charlottesville, Virginia. Neo-Nazis at a state-sanctioned rally advocated for genocide and violence, the second of which they received. A dozen fights between Nazis and counter-protesters broke out across the city, and a man drove his car into a group of people, killing one and injuring others. Another example on an international scale is in Israel, where an online group advocated for the destruction of a Jewish cemetery as a hate crime, and another separate group executed the action, spreading fear throughout the population and profound disrespect for the Jewish people. This contention recognizes the power of words over a group's action and works to eliminate radical hatred against minority groups as a protective measure, as we've seen this method's success in Britain. This brings us to our second contention, that restricting hate speech perpetrated by governments would limit the persecution of minority populations. Speech is often utilized as a tool by prejudiced governments as a platform for normalizing persecutors of minority populations within the state. Look to the persecution of the Rohingya minority within Myanmar. Myanmar's President Aung San Suu Kyi has utilized hate speech advocating for the persecution of this Muslim minority as the scapegoats of society. Because we define speech as equivalent to expression, and thus even written law, both verbal and legally enforceable claims to not recognizing or invading Rohingya villages would be barred, because within true enforcement, restriction of hate speech would apply to those holding public office, as well as the average citizen. Expanding the premise of what this would accomplish, look to the past horrors of Nazi Germany, where Adolf Hitler's direct advocacy for the persecution of the Jewish population would have become illegal under the implementation of full support for the restriction of hate speech. Yes?
I really think that statement simply isn't applicable to today's debate round, given that Nazi Germany was no way fueled or related to hate speech. It really started because of someone who was advocating for this motion. It didn't have to do with specifically his hate speech towards Jewish people.
Well, the advocacy for this motion is exactly what perpetuated the actions. That's the point I'm attempting to make today, that hate-filled speech leads to hate-filled actions. When an ideal is normalized in a society, within a culture, it becomes appropriate to act on it, it becomes more permissible, and leads to the kind of horrors that we've seen in the past. Returning to more current examples, look to the persecution of the Kurdish ethnic group by the Turkish government. If hate speech of President Erdogan, including both written law banning the use of the Kurdish language and inciting the invasion of Kurdish villages, and the speech promoting this agenda were to be restricted, this platform would not infiltrate and prejudice the minds of the Turkish people to the same degree. To clarify, we recognize that in national instances, state governments would be responsible for the enforcement of this mechanism on its people. And thus, this could not work the exact same way with international regulation. But setting this international standard enables nations and international coalitions to act in checking one another to hold the international community to a higher standard. Therefore, we can see enforcement is reasonable, although it would not be reasonable between different countries. Power would be spread throughout the world, protecting each and every ethnic minority group in every single country. Today, this debate really focuses on the power of words to incite actions. When hate speech is able to permeate a society, it normalizes that kind of a mindset. And as that mindset becomes normal, as it becomes accepted, we begin to accept, and in some cases even to promote, actions in accordance with this. And this is not acceptable today, and that is why we stand in firm proposition of the House motion, this House should limit free speech in order to quell hate speech. Thank you. Judges ready? Everyone's ready? Team ready? Okay. Expression of thought is the vehicle for change, progress, and betterment. And a multitude of opinions have a place in free speech. The beauty of free speech is exactly that it is unregulated and not corrupted. As soon as one begins to meddle with the freedom to any real degree of expression, becomes corrupted. It is because we believe that speech must be unregulated that we stand in ardent opposition of today's resolution and support the respect for free speech. Before moving on to our points for today, we'd like to provide a few definitions to clarify today's debate. According to the American Heritage Dictionary, the definitions are as follows. 1. Restriction is a state of keeping within limits. 2. Free speech is the right to express any opinion in public without censorship or restriction from the government. By definition, restricting free speech is a violation of free speech because in free speech's definition, it is something that is not restricted. And 3rd, hate speech is the expression of thoughts, feelings, or perceptions through hostility and animosity.
Is speech not currently restricted in any way?
Speech is, that is very hard to tell because what we are talking about today is not something that's in one nation. So to say that speech is not currently restricted depends on what area you are in. However, we are advocating today that we should not be restricting free speech. And this is the ideal that we vouch for as the side of the opposition. Now, we would like to address the burden our opponents have for today's round. In fact, it is twofold. Firstly, they must show that hate speech warrants restrictions on all speech. Secondly, they must show the harms of hate speech are substantial enough to outweigh the harms of restricting free speech. In essence, they must explain why restrictions are necessary and useful. Yes?
Seeing as the motion specifies restrictions on free speech to combat the rise of hate speech, can't we assume that we could only restrict the areas of free speech that play directly into hate speech?
Yes, but what I'm saying is that by restricting any speech, we are restricting free speech, because free speech is by definition speech without restriction. Thank you. Moving on to our first point, free speech is a fundamental right. Every human is guaranteed to attain a certain unalienable rights. Free speech is one of them. Having free speech is something that we here in the United States take for granted. We can say that we believe we can say what we believe and can openly converse with others without fear of being persecuted for our ideals. It is what separates us, fair and just countries, from dictatorships. When free speech is restricted, for whatever reason, we are no better than an authoritarian regime. Any infringement, however small, is a breach of this fundamental right. Free speech is so important for the well-being of our country. It allows for open discourse, airings of grievances, and an exchange of ideals. Without free speech, there cannot be healthy communication between a government and its people.
Point. Doesn't hate speech limit the openness and availability of communication to the people who the hate speech is directed towards?
Hate speech, while it is unpleasant, it is not something that we should censor, because what is hate speech? This is something that we will get into later, but there is no split line. This is a very gray zone, and to even start is to open ourselves up to a whole world of restricting free speech and restricting actual areas of grievances. Moving on, without free speech, there cannot be healthy communication between the government and its people. When one party has the power over another to punish the first for what they may say, you cannot have honest interaction. It breeds resentment. When a government restricts free speech, the people riot. This can be seen time and time again in history. Take the Beijing Square riots, for example, where hundreds of students took to the streets to oppress an oppressive government regime because they believed that they're in their right for free speech. These students were willing to die for their right to speak freely. And many were even killed by the government. Nonetheless, the rights for free speech were so important to these people that they continued to protest nonetheless. Moving on to my second point, restricting free speech punishes the majority for the crimes of the minority. As I talked about in my first point, free speech is a fundamental right guaranteed to everyone. By restricting free speech, just because the actions of a few bad apples the resolution spoils it for the rest of us. We believe that a person should not be punished for an act they did not do. In the case of this round, this means that the general public should not be punished for the actions of the few. We cannot strip the rights of the entire people just because we are afraid of what they might say.
Yes? So is it the opinion of the opposition that absolutely no limits on free speech are acceptable?
We believe that restricting speech in any way is, in essence, corrupting free speech. Now, to demonstrate the idea of the unfairness of punishing the many for punishing the few, I would like to take you to an example of a classroom. Many of you can look back into your school times and remember that there was one kid who did something that ruined it for the rest of you and caused the teacher to punish the entire class. We've all felt this visceral feeling of unfairness. It is not fair, you might have exclaimed, but I didn't do anything. That kind of injustice you experienced as a child is simply recognizing a fundamental truth. It is unjust to punish the majority for the actions of the minority. In conclusion,
do you think that the majority of the people in the world enjoy spewing hate speech about certain racial minority groups? And if not, how would this apply?
okay, well, exactly. The majority of people are not people who speak hatefully. To punish them by restricting free speech and restricting what they may say, and having these potential consequences for things that are vaguely defined, like what hate speech is, and have a lot of gray area, by punishing the majority of people who are not acting hatefully for the chance that they might be a hateful person is unfair to most people in the world. In conclusion, we cannot support the motion. This is protected time. Sorry. In conclusion, we cannot support the motion because it is fundamentally violating free speech, which is essential to healthy government, and it punishes many of the actions, the money for the actions of few. For all of these reasons, we stand in firm opposition of the motion.
Alrighty. Are my friends ready? My elements? And my judges. And I'll begin. One of my teachers at school, Mr. Bockenfeld, recently went to our administration to express a problem students in our school have been experiencing. It was the presence of the Confederate flag, which has become prevalent in our school. From simply wearing it on clothing or even carrying it around, no matter the form, it was disturbing the school day. Because of the fact that it was inhibiting the learning process, the flag subsequently was eventually banned. From this case, we can see that regulations can and should be made for the well-being and the safety of those that it impacts. And it's for this reason that we stand in firm proposition of the motion that this House supports restrictions on free speech to combat the rise of hate speech. We do so for three major reasons. That first, public safety is improved in nations which nominally restrict hate speech. That second, restricting hate speech perpetrated by the government would limit the persecution of minorities. And that finally, the contention that I will get into now, that it protects vulnerable populations. It is a universally recognized fact that in order to maintain a healthy political culture, the people at large must be participatory members. But the rise of hate speech bars those most in need of a voice of exactly that. We see this reflected in our own society, most heavily in schools, where young people rely on a safe and healthy environment in order to grow. Because schools have the rights of in loco parentis, they essentially have implemented broadly many of the practices that we advocate for today. So when the opposition brings up the idea of a child in school being punished for the action of another, in many ways we support this kind of advocacy for the decreasing hate speech across the world. In both primary, secondary, and on college campuses, schools implement policies that ensure student discourse is fair and equally accessible to all. Because when an individual does not feel safe, they cannot participate in discourse. And this is exactly what my partner was bringing up in her POI. What's important to recognize is that when hate speech is being spewed at a level that people feel unsafe or are physically threatened, they cannot take part in the important discourse that the opposition tells you is so important, and that we tell you is so important to the vitality of a healthy political nation. Furthermore, we see evidence all around us that hate speech ideas lead to much more than hurt feelings, as the opposition would have you believe. These don't just create feelings of unease. Speech that incites violence, such as that which perpetuates rape culture, does much more than create an uncomfortable environment. It leads to real and physical violence against women of all ages, ethnicities, and class. And it's for that reason that we understand that this is not a discussion of who feels hurt in an environment where unsafe language is being perpetuated, but people who are receiving real physical and mental violence against them. Yes?
Hasn't the progress that we have seen in mitigating rape culture not been from shutting people up, but rather having people talk about their experiences? Isn't making people comfortable more to share what they have gone through been the way to solve these problems, not making people be silent?
I'm actually glad you brought that up, because it's a really important distinction that we have to address today in this debate. Limiting free speech for the purpose of combating the rise of hate speech is not the same thing as limiting ideas. We do not support we do not advocate for limiting the ability of people to express themselves. What we do advocate for is limiting the language that they use to do so. Because in an environment where people are using the N-word, where people are screaming racial slurs, where people are threatening violence against others, that is not conducive to discourse. That is not conducive to real political discussion that leads to the kind of change that you advocate for. So in many ways, that entire example goes right to the proposition, because that kind of discourse cannot happen when people feel unsafe. So now I'd like to get into rebuttal of the opposition. First, talking about their ideas regarding the fact that speech is a fundamental right. The opposition tells you that free speech is an inherent right of people. And we, by all means, agree with this statement. But as we've established before, my rights end where yours begin. So yes, we support free speech, but when it begins to infringe upon the physical and mental safety of those being spoken to and about, that is where that speech needs to end. Yes?
Where do you draw that line?
Exactly where I said it does, where I just said, and as well as the way that we've defined hate speech as abusive or threatening speech that either has the intent to cause harm, to a specific demographic. We understand that this isn't easy. We never suggested that the implementation of a policy like this would be easy on an international scale. What we are saying is that it is vital to the discourse that we advocate for as a society. There's a distinct difference there. I'd also like to address the discussion regarding Nazi Germany. The suggestion that Nazi Germany had nothing to do with hate speech is at best blatantly wrong, and at worst entirely dismissive of the rise of a fascist regime like that. No, thank you. What we have to understand is that hate speech as a whole is what led to the rise of Nazi Germany. The consistent hatred of the Jewish people, using them as scapegoats over centuries, is what led to atrocities committed during the Holocaust. Yes, it had everything to do with hate speech, because hate speech is what ignites the fire that ends up in things like genocide. We saw the same thing that's going on with the Rohingya crisis and Myanmar. Additionally, I'd like to address the statement that they made that by instituting these restrictive measures, it spoils it for the rest of us. This is extremely problematic. Only those who are exhibiting hate speech are the ones that are going to be affected by this. So if you're saying it spoils it for the rest of us, that can only mean that you're spoiling hate speech. And by all means, we encourage our government to spoil hate speech. I'm not suggesting that you use hate speech, because that's completely unfair of me. But what I am saying is the only people that this would be spoiled for are the people that are committing hate speech crimes. Yes.
So I'd just like to further clarify, the whole point of the reason why I asked where do we draw the line is simply because the idea behind hate speech is inherently subjective. And so when she talks about this definition of hate speech, we can't put a restriction on something that's purely subjective, therefore this point simply doesn't make sense.
It does make sense, because it's leading to physical violence against people. When it incites violence, when it incites crime, that's hate speech. And we can see that with the rise of rape culture, we can see that with the rise of racial slurs, and we can see the exact repercussions of these events in the several different hate crimes that we have laid out for you, and I'm sure we can continue to do that as this debate continues. Additionally, I'd like to address the idea, and that kind of goes off of that, the idea of enforcement. Like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this motion institutes a standard by which all nations can be judged. For example, the U.S. is reasonably capable of instituting sanctions against another nation once a policy like this is introduced on a global scale. This allows us to set a standard by which all people can be judged. And this is extremely important if we wish to mitigate the response of hate crime and hate speech across the globe. And it's for these reasons that we are proud to propose. Thank you.
Judges ready? Opponents ready? Team ready? Okay, let's begin. So in our first speech, we already established two main things. First of all, free speech is a fundamental right. Second of all, restrictions punish the majority for the actions of the minority. I will now move on to our third point, which is a simple question that no one can truly answer. Where do we draw the line? This is our third point. We can all agree that hate speech is a terrible thing. Nobody's denying that. Obviously, it's awful, and yes, it has some bad consequences. And it hurts people mentally, emotionally, in all sorts of other ways. But the key question I must ask today is, what really is hate speech? Now, of course, we both provided definitions. That's the point of debating this. But when you think about it, hate speech is an incredibly subjective concept. This leads me to our first subpoint of this contention. Subpoint A, hate speech is incredibly subjective. To understand what I mean by this, allow me to use this example. Imagine that you have some sort of disability, say a speech impediment, lisp, or some sort of thing of that sort. Now imagine that every day when you go to work or go to school, people make fun of you for this, they call you names, they do things that some may consider as hate speech. There might be bad consequences of this. You know, someone could, in this condition, someone might become suicidal, or someone might have some sort of horrible outcome of this sort because they're having hate speech said to them. However, there's no level playing field to be able to measure what is and what isn't hate speech. And even though we provided definitions, this simply isn't true. Think about the concept of hate speech. What is hateful, what is not hateful? That is a completely subjective thing. What one person says is hateful might not be agreeable with another person. The point I'm trying to make is, it's impossible to draw the line and say, this is okay and this isn't okay. Even though our opponents are claiming that that's just simply when it leads to bad outcomes, that's not necessarily what hate speech is. Hate speech is the process of saying things that are hateful. And because of this leads me to our second subpoint. Subpoint B, restricting hate speech has huge potential for abuse. Given that the interpretation of what hate speech is and what it is not is incredibly subjective, it would be extremely difficult to actually put restrictions on it. As I brought up before, interpretations greatly differ, and for this reason, it would be very easy for these restrictions to essentially go too far. Yes?
If under the status quo we do have restrictions on free speech to limit hate speech, how can you argue that there's no way that we can propagate this in the future?
Well, actually, you brought this up in your own speech. I'm glad you brought that up. You brought up that it would be very difficult to implement this on a national or even global scale. And the reason for that, the reason why we haven't already done this, is because it's simply too difficult to do. We can't make that level. We would have to literally say these things aren't okay to say, these things are okay to say, if we were to possibly be able to put these restrictions on the scale that we would all want these restrictions to be on. So now to go to an example of what I mean by saying that restrictions could be abused potentially. So imagine one person interprets some sort of what they say is hate speech to be one thing, but someone else disagrees. Who's right? Who says that the one person's interpretation is more valid than the other? By implementing restrictions, people may abuse the fact that not everyone agrees about what hate speech is and what it isn't. This could lead to the infringement on normal free speech, as we brought up in our first point. So in conclusion of our case, freedom of speech is a fundamental right. By implementing restrictions on hate speech, we could potentially be punishing the majority for the actions of the minority, because we would be limiting what people can say, even if some may interpret that as hate speech. Basically, in conclusion, hate speech is simply not definable, and for these reasons, and the reasons we brought up previously, I stand in firm opposition, and I will now move on to addressing my opponent's case. So the first argument was essentially that public safety would be improved, and then they cited the example of the Public Order Act. However, this one act did work in certain circumstances. As I said, it decreased certain amounts of hate crimes, I believe, or they said something about how this had good impacts. However, this wouldn't really work on a global scale. As I brought up before, or not even a global scale, a national scale. This simply would not have the effects that we want it to have. This specific act was really specific to minorities. They brought up the LGBT community, they brought up people of different races, and by having the resolution that we are having today, we would be restricting all hate speech, not just hate speech to those people, and therefore we would be restricting any type of speech that people consider as hate speech, and as I brought up before, it is incredibly difficult to define exactly what that is.
Point of clarification.
Yes, please.
I would just like to clarify that at the beginning of our debate, we instituted a mechanism where the Public Order Act would actually be invoked internationally, meaning that the limitations set forth by the act will actually apply, and that is where we draw the line.
So I'm glad that you brought that up. Once again, I do not think, and I'm guessing a lot of people would agree with me on this is simply not possible. We can't tell people this is not something that you can say and this is something that you can say simply because certain people interpret it as hateful or not hateful. They also claim that radical politicians would hold less power by having these restrictions. However, they would have the same equal amount of power. This simply is a logical fallacy, saying that because radical politicians currently use hate speech to gain followers, that's simply not true. They use their ideas to gain followers, not the hate speech. All people can agree that when people in power say horrible things that are considered hate speech, those people are not usually looked upon in a good light. In fact, most people would agree that people don't like it when politicians do that. Therefore, they would not hold less power. They would simply, people who follow them today would still follow them then, because they don't follow them for their hate speech, they follow them for their ideas. They also brought up that Britain had less violence fueled by hate speech, but once again, as I said, this would not apply on a global scale or an international scale as they are suggesting. The second point is that this resolution would limit the persecution on minority populations, and they brought up the example of Nazi Germany. Now this is incredibly important. They are missing a key difference. There's an extremely different thing between hate speech and hatefulness. What we saw in Nazi Germany was hatefulness. It was people persecuting these Jewish people because they were Jewish and other sorts of minorities. This is not necessarily hate speech. Now, hate speech might have contributed to it, but we can't blame Nazi Germany because of hate speech. That's simply a logical fallacy again. They also, in the beginning of their last speech, they brought up the example of the Confederate flag at the beginning, people wearing Confederate flag shirts and disrupting their education. This isn't hate speech, so I just like to disregard that example. They brought up in their point 3 that, which was that it protects vulnerable populations, and they brought up the example that schools have already implemented restrictions. So you can advocate not to limit the spread of ideas. However, putting restrictions on hate speech would be putting restrictions on any form of speech. And I don't know how to say this in any clearer of a way. When you put restrictions on one type of speech, you're putting it on all types of speech, therefore limiting our freedom of speech. They also claim that when individuals don't feel safe, they cannot function, and obviously this is true. Hate speech is a horrible thing, but simply these restrictions would not be effective in the scale that we all want it to be on. For these reasons and the reasons that we have previously brought up, I can see no other than a ballot in opposition of today's presented motion. Thank you.
Whenever everyone's ready.
Friends, other friends.
We brought to you today an issue that has very real impacts. The impacts are the church shooting in Charleston, the young girl who was raped in Pakistan as a hate crime, the Rochester, New York Jewish cemeteries which were destroyed, the 17-year-old Muslim girl who was killed walking home after praying at a mosque, and the mosque in Plainfield, in our own next door, which was vandalized. Because we have to address these key circumstances, because we can't prioritize free speech for those who use it to exercise hate speech over the protection of these individuals, we must stand in firm proposition of today's House motion that this House supports restrictions on free speech to combat the rise of hate speech. So to go into this rebuttal speech, first we'll touch on the definitions and the framing of today's debate. It's been brought up repeatedly in POIs by team opposition, where do we draw the line? And where can we ensure that this enforcement could actually take place? We have two responses to this. The first one is while team opposition was unable to answer in a POI whether or not there was actually precedent of the limitation of hate speech in the past, we can tell you for certain that there is. When we looked at the example of the United States, we saw what was once in place, the Chaplinsky Doctrine, to now what we have as the doctrine of imminent lawless action. The judiciary reviews these concepts to determine what is within the lines of free speech and what is within the lines of hate speech. So we have clear precedent within the United States of when this works. Additionally, if we look to our mechanism, which has been ignored by team opposition, we define hate speech in accordance with the Public Order Act of 1986, which is currently in effect in the UK. So we see not only in the United States, but also in the UK, a clear example of when hate speech can actually be limited. And while this may not be perfect in every instance, while the line is not absolutely clear because individuals are affected by multiple thoughts and by bias, this is why we have judiciary systems to review this. We don't not interpret law, we don't not implement law simply because we fear for our ability to carry it out. So when we tell you our definition under the Public Order Act in the UK, this means that speech which is abusive and threatening against any racial, religious, gender, or LGBT groups would be outlawed. The worldwide implementation of the Public Order Act will also function as our mechanism throughout today's debate and continues to do so. Now moving on from that, we have two key questions throughout today's debate. The first one being which side promotes democracy and civil discourse, and the second being which side promotes tangible of the public safety of targeted populations. Yes? Thank you. So, moving on to this first concept of which side promotes democracy and civil discourse. Team opposition tries to tell you in flowery language that expression is the beauty of free speech. However, what we ask team opposition today is who they're protecting in these public spaces of discussion, who they're allowing this free speech to be had for.
We would say that we are protecting everyone because everyone has the right to free speech.
And we'll go on to negate why that simply is not true. So for which populations do you choose to protect this discussion when we're asked this question, when the opposition does not limit in any way hate speech, one's exclusion from the discussion sphere results as a result of this. When hate speech is directed towards an individual, then they are now instilled with this fear, and a valid fear, as we brought to you multiple examples of when hate speech does come to fruition in acts of public violence and acts that interfere with one's public safety. When an individual is threatened by these instances, they no longer have the free use of speech, they no longer have the unlimited potential to engage in these discussions in which they're so viably needed. The proposition would rather restrict free speech for those who use free speech for hate than restrict the speech of targeted minorities who use this free speech to dissolve this kind of hateful rhetoric. Now, we move on to the second major issue of team opposition, that they amplify the magnitude of who this motion would actually impact and would actually take certain speech-related rights away from. It's not the few bad apples example that they attempt to bring to you, rather it's the example that if that one individual within the classroom were exercising hate speech, that one individual would be punished. If the entire class were exercising hate speech, yes, the entire class would be punished. And that's exactly the way that we need to see this happening. We're not restricting any free speech beyond hate speech, and as a result of that, we're not restricting speech from any individual who does not exercise hate speech. And that's something crucial to today's round. Additionally, when we do so, we are not punishing the majority because team opposition conceded that it is not the majority of individuals who exercise hate speech, thankfully for this. However, even if it were to be the majority which attempted to exercise hate speech, this is only more of a reason that we need to act. If the majority of individuals within the world are now using their rights of free speech to exercise hate speech, this is only more of a reason to do something about it. Yes?
So the people that are being punished are everyone because everyone is having their free speech restricted. The majority of people in this instance are the majority of people who are being punished unfairly because these people have done nothing wrong. And the majority of people have done nothing wrong, and so the majority of people have been punished unfairly.
Those who are not exercising hate speech will in no way have their free speech restricted. This motion applies only to free speech, which would limit hate speech. So now moving on to the second key question today, which team better upholds the tangible effects of public safety for targeted populations? The first layer under this is the idea of sexual assault. Team opposition tells you that discussion is what ends sexual assault, and we completely agree with this, but we say that productive discussion is what ends sexual assault. Allowing individuals to promote ideals which propagate rape culture and allowing for this kind of free speech to infiltrate these discussions is not what leads to the end of rape culture. And as we brought up in our previous analysis of this, by allowing for hate speech to be carried out against those individuals who are so vitally needed in order to act against this kind of hate speech, those individuals would be precluded from this discussion altogether. Now we'll move on to the idea of our international examples. First of all, team opposition throughout today's debate has repeatedly referred to the United States as the framework for today's debate, and so that's led to a neglect of our international examples. Additionally, they operate on the idea that free speech is an inherent value which all value equally to mean the same thing as unrestricted speech. And in doing so, they imply the use and reliance upon the American First Amendment. Seeing as that's not an international value that we can actually hold, this doesn't hold up in today's debate. Now, moving on to this idea of international examples. We gave you the example of Myanmar, where the persecution of the Rohingya Muslim minority was entirely within the legal framework of Myanmar. Because we've equated in our previous speeches text to expression to speech, then any textual doctrine and legal support for this kind of persecution would no longer be allowed under Team Proposition's framework. At the least that this does, even if it cannot be regulated by that state, is set an international standard and a call to action for international coalitions and for other nations to enforce this. Finally, moving on to the example of Nazi Germany, we would like to touch on the fact that propaganda is a form of expression and a form of speech. So when hateful propaganda was used, that directly led to instilling the mindsets of the individuals throughout Nazi Germany of propagating a pro-Aryan race concept and persecuting the Jewish minorities. We see that there is a direct causation here. And so because we stand for populations which are disproportionately affected by hate speech, we must vote in firm proposition of today's House motion. Thank you.
So I'll be going down my opponent's flow and then clarifying our definitions as I go. So our opponents began the round by saying that hate speech should be relegated to just hate speech against certain groups. And I want to just start off by saying that's extremely limiting, and in terms of the resolution, we should not consider that definition. Their first point was that they have seen a positive precedent in Britain. So one of their subpoints was that this removed voices from both ends of the political spectrum. So first I want to say that it's far easier to stop violence when violence is indicted at a political gathering. On the other hand, if, for example, an Israeli online group advocates for a hate crime, that's extremely hard, A, to track or to find out about, and thus B, to stop. So what you're doing by saying that you can't have hate speech in public is just driving it underground. And that actually makes it A, harder to track, and B, far harder thus to enforce and thus to stop the violence that is caused by this hate speech. Then they said that negative voices are minimized. So what I want to point out here is that
I would just like to clarify that the British government is consistently able to find and to enforce their speech laws on online content.
So they said then that negative voices are minimized, right? And I want to say that that's completely dependent on what speech is targeted. So in terms of the resolution, in terms of what hate speech actually is, it's hateful speech against any group, against any concept. It can't be relegated just to what Britain decides it is. That's just one country. If we're talking in general, if we're talking in terms of the resolution, because we as a House are not supposed to be debating as Britain, we're supposed to be debating as an actual group of legislators, as any country, not just Britain. So what occurs by this is that the speech that's targeted is dependent upon the majority. So I want to give the example of the Deep South. So let's go, for example, to the Revolutionary War. If I'm in the South, right, and I'm the government of the South, they clearly relegated hate speech against slavery. So the speech against slavery, it has to be categorized as hate speech because it's hateful against the concept of slavery. So you can't relegate the concept, the idea of hate speech to just the things that you disagree with.
Wait.
That can't be how this resolution is defined because that's extremely limited.
Seeing as our definition specifically outlined racial hate speech as something that was abusive speech under the Public Order Act, wouldn't this apply to the discussion of slavery?
Right, okay. So I'm saying that the South actually stopped hate speech against slavery, right? So your definition only applies to what Britain's legislature says it is, and in terms of this resolution, you have to see that we're debating what the definitions actually say. This has to be a debate that doesn't apply to just one country. No, thank you. So then, the second point was that this would limit persecution of minorities, and they gave the example of Adolf Hitler in Germany. So first off, I want to point out that if they had instituted the policy in Germany, if they had made it illegal to indict hate speech against Jewish people, that would have done absolutely nothing to stop Hitler. I'm actually completely certain that it was in fact illegal to commit genocide in in Germany, and that occurred nonetheless. So the fact that dictators would be stopped by a simple law that says, please don't perpetrate hate speech against certain racial groups is absolutely absurd. Okay. So that effect is null and void. So Adolf Hitler, he would have been absolutely not stopped by that law. He was not stopped by any laws. That's the entire point, is that dictators and people in that situation, they aren't stopped by a simple law that says, please don't do this. They aren't even stopped by laws that says, please don't kill 6 million people. So that's absolutely absurd.
Point.
Thank you. So the problem with affirming this resolution lies exactly with cases like Hitler or a government with corruption. So whoever is in power gets to regulate. So that means that whatever speech they decide is hateful, whatever speech they decide they're against, they get to regulate that speech. And once again, since this is a general discussion, we can't just relegate it to what Britain decides is hate speech.
It was brought up within our framework that this would be a call to action for other nations and international coalitions to act as regulating forces. We would in no way be asking Nazi Germany to regulate itself from being Nazi Germany.
Okay, you also brought up current examples, actually, about dictators. And so I would say, are you going to ask those dictators to regulate their entire country? Because they actually stand exactly against that. So it's not just Hitler. There's dictators the world over. So you can't actually make them also do this. It's not feasible to enact just Britain's law on everyone. So that's why, in terms of this resolution, that can't be considered. So in essence, whoever is in power gets to regulate hate speech. That means that they get to A, regulate how this obstruction of free speech is taken care of, for example, with extreme violence, and also what exactly counts as hate speech. So the reason this resolution can't be affirmed is that we can't be given any guarantee on the effects of limiting free speech, because the result is highly dependent on circumstance. So we, acting and debating as a House in general, can't affirm that we should in fact corrupt and limit the freedom of speech in light of hateful speech, because once again, it's absolutely dependent on circumstance. The third contention was that this protects vulnerable populations. Once again, I would point to the fact that, firstly, there's actually many of the people that perpetrate hate speech, for example, in the South, they were the minority. So the majority in the South were the white supremacists. So if you're looking at the resolution as it stands, not just in Britain's terms, then you have to see that this doesn't protect the vulnerable populations, because the people perpetrating hate speech are usually in the minority. So in terms of that, you're not protecting the vulnerable populations, you're not protecting the people in the South who are against slavery, because it's completely dependent on circumstances. So their third point is null and void once again. And then they said that we aren't limiting ideas, just the words and phrases used. So I would say if I advocate for hatred against African Americans in a very well-mannered way, and cause, for example, violence, how is that A, not hate speech, and B, how is that not the limiting of ideas?
This clarification, specifically in relation to sexual assault, was saying that we don't limit the discussion of sexual assault, we simply limit the discussion in which individuals attempt to propagate.
Okay. So, I want to move on then to the fact that fundamentally, once again, I want to go back to the resolution because I think this is the crux of today's debate. So, I just want to clarify that we can't look only to Britain because the resolution is not specific. And as we're debating this in terms of like X country, not exactly Britain. It's just a country in general. We have to look to the world. And you can't, once again, you can't enforce upon dictators, current day, not just Adolf Hitler, to not perpetrate hate speech. So fundamentally, the people who are silenced by violations of free speech change every day. So we have to see that their examples, for example, coming down on racism and attacks on the LGBT community, that resonates with us because we fundamentally disagree with racism, right? But look to the other side. There's also a precedence against ideas that we agree with, against speech that was hateful against, for example, racism. There's been a precedent in history where dictators or where people such as the South perpetrated, they stopped the hate speech in their country or in their part of the world. And that also has to be considered hate speech because we can't relegate it to just a single country. That's just not how this debate should function. So while most of us would agree that racism is bad, we would also agree that speaking out against racism is good. So for that reason, we can't just look to their one example. We have to view this debate as a whole, and thus end it.
Pages ready?
Team ready? Okay, then let's begin. So first off, I'd just like to provide reasons why our team is winning today's debate round, essentially, because of our points. Then I would like to move on to readdressing some of my opponent's points, providing clarifications, and going over voting issues. So first, just to go back over our own points. Let's just go back to the very idea free speech is a fundamental right, which I believe that we all agree on. However, there's been some miscommunication. They say that given that free speech isn't technically allowed everywhere, there's certain countries that don't say that free speech is allowed, then therefore it's not a fundamental right. However, think about it. Speaking your mind, being able to express your ideas, that is incredibly fundamental. That's human nature. When people want to be able to express their ideas, they can do that through the fundamental right of free speech. And limiting it in any way, shape, or form, whether it be hate speech or any sort of other speech, is simply fundamentally wrong. As we brought up, hate speech, once again, is a completely subjective term. What I was trying to say by this is exactly what our third speaker brought up. He said essentially that it depends on who's in charge, it depends on what regulations and restrictions apply. And as our opponents have basically been basing this debate off of certain examples involving the Public Order Act, this simply cannot be preferred. This is my first voting issue. We cannot prefer the definitions because they're too limited. We should be looking at this house, we should be looking at all countries. That's the point of World Schools debate. We aren't debating about one particular government. So, given that we've cleared up this whole issue of what exactly hate speech is, and the fact that it really is subjective and it cannot be put into exact terms as they are trying to do it, it is only preferred that this point flows to the proposition. Now to move on to the second reason. So we talked about the whole idea of how there's really no guarantee on the effects of limiting hate speech. And though they have brought up certain examples of how limiting hate speech has had certain good impacts, this is not going to be true everywhere. We can't limit hate speech if we don't have a definition for hate speech, and we can't limit hate speech if we can't say, basically, it's circumstantial. That's what I'm trying to get across. One leader might think that something is bad, and another leader might think something is good, and therefore their two definitions of hate speech, or even certain people's or government's definitions of hate speech, would collide, and therefore these restrictions would not be applicable. In addition, to go back to our second point, which is that restrictions punish the majority for the actions of the minority, this whole idea is essentially saying that we'd be limiting free speech. We'd be limiting speech in general by limiting hate speech, because as I brought up time and time again, hate speech is incredibly subjective. Then to once again go back to our own case and bolster our third point, which is where do we draw the line? This is what I've been trying to convey this whole time. Where do we draw the line? That is simply an impossible to answer question. For these reasons, I stand in firm proposition, and I will now move on to readdressing their arguments. They said that public safety would be improved. However, we've already addressed this. They basically only cited the Public Order Act and other acts that are really specific. We need to be looking at the broad general scale. In addition, they talked about how limiting persecution on minority populations, this would occur through the resolution. However, once again, this is completely circumstantial, and it depends on different leaders in different circumstances. So because this House believes in protecting the fundamental human right of free speech, and because hate speech sadly falls under this category, we oppose today's resolution. Thank you.
Today, the opposition has told you two things. First, that free speech is a fundamental right, and that second, there is no way that we can implement such a policy on an international scale. And I will stand here today and tell you why each of these is a flawed argument in opposition to the motion that this House supports restrictions on free speech to combat the rise of hate speech, and why we are so proud to propose. First, we must address the kind of free speech that this House advocates for. The opposition would have you believe that the restriction of any speech is a violation of basic rights, but this is fundamentally flawed. First of all, if the majority doesn't participate in hate speech, their actions will not be limited. If they do engage in hate speech, they are a member of a hateful minority that must be limited to ensure the peace for everyone else. Assuming that because we implement policies that restrict hate speech or restrict the rise of hate speech, automatically restricts the speech of the majority is inherently flawed, because we already exist in a society where certain kinds of speech are undeniably limited. You can't scream fire in a public theater. That is a kind of speech. And the opposition would have you believe that that limitation on speech is a violation of basic rights, when that is obviously not the case. Additionally, we have to address that under the framework of this debate, the proposition sets a mechanism in which the public, that mirrors the Public Order Act of 1986 and expands this order to all nations. That mitigates the entire argument that the opposition has regarding the fact that we have no way of implementing this on a national scale, on an international scale, that we have no definition of hate speech. This simply isn't true. This tells us two major things. First, these classes that are protected under the Act are those that would be extended to the rest of the world. Those are the minority classes that are most widely regarded as receiving the majority of hate speech. No, hate speech. The definition of hate speech has nothing to do with advocating against slavery or against other kinds of hateful speech. Under that assumption, anyone who disagrees with anything is therefore committing hate speech, and that is illogical. It doesn't stand in this debate. Second, we have to address that despite what the opposition has told you, they have provided the proposition with no evidence that this policy would not work on an international scale. They've told you that over and over again, that it doesn't work, but they've provided no evidence and no understanding of why that is true. The proposition's arguments and our examples aren't too specific just because the opposition doesn't have any, other than repetitive hypotheticals in which they invite you to imagine a world in which something is true. This doesn't hold up. Just like the discussion regarding Nazi Germany simply does not hold up. There is no way that you can argue the propaganda that took place for centuries leading up to the Holocaust does not qualify as hate speech. And there is no way to argue that this kind of policy on an international scale would not mitigate those issues, would not have lessened the burden upon the Jewish people. It is unreasonable and illogical and does not stand under this debate. We have to look at this looking at this on an international scale. We set a precedent that can be upheld and can be enforced from other nations. No, we do not expect dictators to enforce this policy. In fact, we brought up an example of President Erdogan. We do not expect him to implement this policy himself. What we are saying is that by implementing this as an international standard, we allow the international community to work against governments that act in the way that President Erdogan does. And it's for this reason that we stand for the rights of all humans, not just those that have the loudest voices, that we are proud to propose. Thank you.
Genocide was